Some tragedies are so impactful that they transcend time, becoming permanent scars on the collective memory. The Joelma building fire in 1974 wasn't just an accident. It was a landmark of horror that exposed human vulnerability in the face of negligence and the unpredictable. What began as an ordinary day, with scheduled meetings and morning coffees, ended with scenes so devastating that they still seem surreal today. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the fire itself. It was the silence that remained after the flames went out, as if the building still carried in its walls the echoes of the suffering lived there. And don't think this is just another story of urban tragedy. The Joelma was the scene of something that defies rational explanations. Among the rubble, reports emerged of voices, shadows, and an oppressive feeling that led many to avoid the place even after its reconstruction. It's as if, in addition to the lives lost, something else remained trapped there. An invisible but palpable mark that refuses to be forgotten. The fact is that this story goes far beyond the news of the time. It touches on something deeper: the fragility of life, human negligence, and the inexplicable that haunts even the most skeptical. But before judging this as superstition or exaggeration, you need to understand what really happened on that hot Friday in February. The failures, the split-second decisions, the acts of heroism, and, of course, the legends that emerged in the days that followed. Get ready, because what you're about to discover is not just a historical account. It's a dive into one of Brazil's darkest and most intriguing chapters. And, in the end, you'll ask yourself, have the flames really gone out completely? In the 1970s, Sao Paulo was experiencing an era of rapid growth, and the Joelma building symbolized this advancement. Built in the financial heart of the city, it was not just another skyscraper, but a landmark of progress and modernity. With its straight lines, mirrored facade, and state-of-the-art infrastructure for the time, the building stood out on the urban horizon, reflecting not only the sunlight but also the ambition of those who worked there. It was the kind of place that conveyed status. Being in the Joelma was, in a way, a sign of professional success. The routine inside the building followed the typical rhythm of any corporate center. In the morning, the elevators filled with men in suits and women with briefcases in hand, while the smell of fresh coffee escaped from the small pantries scattered across the floors. Incessant phone calls, the clatter of typewriters, and the sound of heels clicking against the floor echoed through the corridors. It was a common, almost banal scene, but one that, for many, represented the fulfillment of a dream. A stable job, a decent salary, and the feeling of being in the right place at the right time. The Joelma was also a reflection of the optimistic spirit of the time. Advertisements touted its commercial spaces as the future of the corporate market, and newspapers highlighted its strategic location, close to the city's main thoroughfares. Entrepreneurs signed contracts there. Accounting firms closed quarterly balance sheets. Lawyers discussed complex cases. It was more than a building. It was a stage where people's daily lives unfolded, full of small achievements and daily challenges. But, as with any structure built on confidence and progress, there was something invisible in the fine print: negligence regarding safety. At that time, fire safety regulations were still in their infancy in Brazil. The Joelma, like many commercial buildings, lacked adequate emergency exits and an effective system to contain fire. It was a detail that went unnoticed. After all, who imagines that a tragedy can happen in the midst of a common routine? People worried about deadlines, not fire extinguishers. The building, which seemed unshakable, housed within it not only dreams but also silent risks. And it was precisely this false sense of security that made everything even more devastating when the first spark broke the balance of that bubble of stability. The day that began like any other was about to turn into a dark landmark in the city's history. And, as you'll see, this change happened faster than anyone could imagine. It was an ordinary February morning in São Paulo. The city's typical heat was already present early in the day, and the Joelma building was following its usual flow. Employees arrived in a hurry, some carrying briefcases, others holding cups of coffee, while the elevators filled with conversations about deadlines and meetings. No one imagined that, in the midst of this routine, a small electrical fault, almost imperceptible, was already underway on the 12th floor. A short circuit in the air conditioning, something banal like so many that occur in any building, but which, on that day, would be the trigger for one of the biggest urban tragedies in Brazil. The scariest thing was the silence at the beginning. The overheated wire began to melt the wiring, while the flames fed on the flammable material around it. Wooden partitions, curtains, papers stacked on office desks. There was no explosion, no immediate warning. The smoke was the first sign, spreading like a shadow through the corridors, invading rooms before any alarm could sound. At that time, few buildings had automatic fire detection systems. Security was still seen as something secondary, a bureaucratic detail. When they realized something was wrong, it was already too late. The fire advanced with ruthless speed, as if each object was perfect fuel for destruction. The carpets turned into flames. The walls seemed to breathe smoke and heat. Witnesses reported that, in a matter of minutes, the environment turned into a suffocating hell. Those who were on the lower floors managed to descend the stairs, but for those who worked from the 11th floor upwards, the scene was already one of despair. The escape routes, so ignored on ordinary days, now seemed non-existent. And here is the cruelest point. No one was prepared for that. The internal stairs were soon taken over by smoke, making it impossible to breathe. The windows, which should have been an exit, were sealed by outdated safety regulations. Some people tried to improvise, wetting cloths and covering their faces, as if they were in a survival movie. But this was not fiction. It was raw reality, without cuts or scripts. Time, which previously seemed controllable in work schedules, was now running against everyone. The fire, invisible at the beginning, became a voracious entity, consuming not only the building but also the certainties of those who believed they were safe in their work environment. And, as the first sirens echoed through the streets of São Paulo, those who were inside realized that the fight for survival would be much more difficult than anyone could imagine. By this point, the flames had already transformed the Joelma into an incandescent prison, and the worst was yet to come. When the flames took over the upper floors, the Joelma building ceased to be a work environment and turned into a labyrinth of panic. The corridors, once bustling with hurried footsteps and voices of those rushing against deadlines, were now dominated by the sound of screams muffled by the dense smoke. With each passing minute, the heat intensified, turning metal doors into scalding barriers impossible to touch. The windows, sealed to ensure thermal insulation, now became transparent prisons for those who, in desperation, looked into the abyss of more than 20 floors. For those inside, time seemed to dilate. Amid the chaos, employees tried to improvise exits, tying curtains together as makeshift ropes, while others waved for help, banging on the windows already fogged by soot. The internal stairs, the only escape routes from the building, were quickly taken over by toxic smoke. Those who tried to descend were faced with the horror of darkened and oxygen-deprived corridors. For many, the only choice was to go up, a cruel paradox, as each flight of stairs brought them even closer to the intense heat that rose like a blast from a furnace. Outside, the city watched, in disbelief, what seemed like a live nightmare. Helicopters were called in, but the heat radiating from the building prevented any attempt at rescue from the top. In some windows, groups waved white cloths, signaling their position. But as the fire advanced, hope faded along with the oxygen. It was at this moment that the jumps of death began. people, cornered by the unbearable heat, preferred to risk jumping into the void rather than face the agony of being consumed by the flames. Reports describe scenes of colleagues hugging each other before jumping, a final gesture of solidarity amid absolute despair. The media, which quickly arrived at the scene, captured images that would mark the country's collective memory. Scenes of people hanging from windows, waving frantically, and then the sepulchral silence after each fall. It was no longer a fire. It was an emotional collapse, an open wound in the heart of São Paulo. And while firefighters tried to contain the advance of the flames with hoses insufficient for the height of the building, inside, those who were still breathing fought against time and their own awareness that escape seemed increasingly unattainable. In this scenario of absolute horror, each floor above the fire became a dark chapter in a tragedy unfolding in real time. And among the dozens of stories that intertwined in the flames, one of them would gain prominence for its brutality and later, for the mystery it would leave as a legacy. The 13 souls who would seek refuge in an elevator, unaware that that decision would mark them forever. Amid the chaos that consumed the Joelma building, some sought refuge wherever they found a breath of hope. In the desperation to escape the flames, 13 people decided to enter an elevator, believing that this metal cubicle could be their salvation. Among them were colleagues who, until minutes before, shared everyday concerns, deadlines, meetings, reports. Now, everyone was united by a single goal: to survive. The elevator, however, was not a sanctuary. It was a silent trap, which would isolate them from the fire, but not from death. The elevator stalled between floors, and the air began to thin rapidly. The walls, heated by the intense heat, turned the space into a suffocating chamber. Later reports indicated that, at the height of despair, the occupants tried everything: pressed buttons, banged on the doors, shouted for help. But the building was collapsing, and the elevator was just another detail amid the destruction. The silence that followed was deafening. When they were finally found, everyone was already dead from asphyxiation, embraced by the heat and helplessness. The image of the sealed elevator, with the bodies of the 13 victims, became a symbol of the cruelest side of that tragedy. They were not just numbers in a fatality report. They were interrupted stories, broken families, dreams burned by a fire that no one foresaw. What makes this part even darker is the fact that, even after the fire was controlled, the feeling that something still inhabited that space remained. Employees who worked on the reconstruction claimed to feel presences, hear whispers, as if the elevator carried, in addition to the physical marks, an eternal echo of suffering. This is how the legend of the 13 souls was born. The bodies were buried side by side, in a common grave in the São Pedro Cemetery in São Paulo. The graves, in themselves, became a point of pilgrimage, with visitors lighting candles, offering prayers, and, curiously, reporting inexplicable experiences. Some say that, on silent nights, it is possible to hear murmurs coming from that direction, as if the souls, still trapped in a cycle of despair, seek the escape they never achieved. The story of the 13 souls transcended time, transforming into one of the biggest urban myths in Brazil. For many, it is just a superstition fueled by tragedy. For others, it is proof that human suffering can leave scars not only in memory but also in the physical environment. And speaking of scars, the Joelma would never be the same after that fateful morning. Neither for those who survived, nor for those who watched helplessly from the outside. When the last flames were finally controlled, what remained of the Joelma building was a charred skeleton, a macabre monument of concrete and twisted iron. The firefighters, exhausted, walked among the wreckage in search of survivors, but with each door broken down, the scene was always the same. Destroyed rooms, melted furniture, and bodies in positions that revealed the desperate struggle for a last breath. In all, 187 lives were lost, while more than 300 people were injured. But the numbers, cold in official reports, did not capture the true dimension of the pain that hung over the city. Sao Paulo, accustomed to the fast pace of its days, stopped. Newspapers splashed shocking headlines. Radio stations interrupted their programming to update the number of victims, and the images broadcast on television entered homes like a punch to the stomach. In the following weeks, conversations in cafes, on public transport, and in companies revolved around the Joelma. People pointed to the horizon, staring at that dark carcass that stood out among the neighboring buildings, as if time itself had frozen there, exactly at 8:45 a.m. on that fateful Friday. The authorities were soon under pressure. How could such a modern building turn into a deadly trap? The answer lay in the security flaws, the neglected regulations, and the blind confidence that nothing will happen. The Joelma had no external emergency exits. The fire extinguishers were insufficient, and, above all, the internal cladding was highly flammable. It was like throwing gasoline on a fire. The tragedy not only exposed the structural weaknesses, but also made it clear that progress, without responsibility, can be as dangerous as fire itself. And, as with any collective trauma, the emotional scars ran even deeper. Many survivors never set foot in a commercial building again. People who lost co-workers gave up their careers, while entire families grieved without even having a body to bury. To this day, those who lived through that day report nightmares, flashbacks, and a constant feeling of insecurity in enclosed spaces. The Joelma building, even after being renovated and renamed, was never just a building again. It became a symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that the most ordinary routine can suddenly turn to ashes. But perhaps the most unsettling thing is that, even after decades, the feeling that something remains inside that building has never completely disappeared. Reports of apparitions, unexplained noises, and a sudden chill on certain floors keep alive the legend that the Joelma carries not only physical scars, but also spiritual ones. And so, the building that once symbolized progress is now, for many, a grim reminder that safety, life, and routine can be destroyed in a matter of minutes, when you least expect it. And now that you know the details of this striking tragedy, an inevitable question arises. What can we really learn from this? Because, you see, the Joelma building fire wasn't just an isolated accident. It was a brutal reminder of how negligence, lack of preparation, and the belief that it won't happen to me can cost lives. And if we look around, how many Joelmas are still out there? How many environments do we frequent every day, blindly trusting that everything is under control? But perhaps the most powerful lesson isn't in the ashes of the past, but in the way we face the present. When was the last time you stopped to think about your own safety? At work, at home, in schools, in the places you frequent? It sounds like an exaggeration, I know, until the day it isn't. And it's not just about physical safety, but also emotional and mental well-being. Being aware, questioning, demanding change. That's what separates prevention from tragedy. So, I ask you, are you going to let this story be just another one you heard? Or are you going to use it as a warning to take action? The choice is yours. And if you want to continue exploring topics like this, understand the past to transform the present and protect the future, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this content. Because stories like the Joelmas don't exist just to scare. They exist to wake us up. But speaking of stories that go beyond what the eyes can see, the next story may be even more disturbing. Imagine being alone in a familiar place, but suddenly feeling like you're not alone anymore. Unexplained sensations, voices that seem to come from nowhere, and a presence that you can't ignore. This is the experience of those who dared to approach the 13 souls after the fire. And I have to warn you, this story is not for the faint of heart. If you found what you've heard so far impactful, wait until you know the darkest side of this tragedy. There are places where silence isn't peace, but a warning. A warning that something remains unfinished, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. A cemetery, for many, is just a field of eternal rest. But what if I told you that not all rest is truly eternal? That beneath the cold earth and worn tombstones, there are stories that continue to pulse, waiting for a chance to be heard? Sounds like an exaggeration? Antonio, a veteran and skeptical gravedigger, thought so too. He had spent decades dealing with death as if it were just another detail of the routine. He dug, closed tombs, cleaned the ground, and left, never listening to the legends that surrounded the cemetery where he worked. But everything changed on a hot summer night when something or someone decided to break the cycle of silence. And what started as a common round turned into a direct confrontation with the inexplicable. Get ready to meet the story of Antonio, the Silent Guardian. A story that isn't about believing or not in the supernatural, but about what happens when you come across something that defies your logic and forces you to question everything. And believe me, after hearing this, you'll never see a cemetery the same way again. Are you ready to discover what really happens when the lights go out and silence takes over? Working as a gravedigger never bothered me. Since I was young, I've always been one of those who believed more in what they saw than in what they heard. Superstitions? Nonsense from those who can't deal with death. At 56, sunburnt skin, gray hair, and hazel eyes, I had seen it all. I buried children, old people, young people, each with their interrupted story. And the cemetery? It was my silent domain, a place of peace for the living and rest for the dead. On that hot summer night, the air felt denser than usual. The sky, moonless, left everything plunged into a deep darkness, cut only by the worn lantern I carried. My job was simple: make the last round, ensure the gates were closed, and that no curious people or vandals were around. I walked among the worn tombstones, feeling the characteristic smell of damp earth mixed with the sweet scent of withered flowers left by visitors during the day. The curious thing is that, even without believing in legends, I always avoided the area of the 13 souls. It was more habit than real fear, an unconscious detour, like avoiding stepping on cracks in the sidewalk. That part of the cemetery seemed different, colder, even on stuffy nights. The tombstones were simple, lined up like soldiers in eternal rest, each marking the abrupt end of lives cut short in the Joelma building fire. As I walked, something bothered me. A strange smell, subtle, but unmistakable. Smoke. Not that of a cigarette or distant barbecue, but something more rancid, like burnt paper. I looked around, but the cemetery was empty, as always. The smell came in gusts, as if the wind brought and took away a silent warning. My footsteps echoed on the dirt floor, breaking the heavy silence that hovered between the tombs. That's when I heard it for the first time. A weak sound, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere ahead. I stopped, holding the lantern more firmly. Help! The word dissipated in the air, as if the wind itself carried it away. My heart raced, but reason quickly intervened. Could be a homeless person hiding there, or even a cat knocking something over. The mind always seeks logical explanations when fear begins to poke at sanity. I quickened my pace, deciding to ignore the sound. But with each meter traveled, the murmurs increased. Loose, disjointed words, like fragments of interrupted conversations. Smoke? I can't breathe. Open the door. I stopped, swallowing hard. The light of the lantern flickered for an instant, as if the energy itself refused to illuminate that path. I looked at the area of the 13 souls. The fog that always seemed to hover over that corner of the cemetery was denser, almost palpable. The tombstones seemed more worn under the flickering light, as if decades had passed in just a few hours. The air became warmer, and a chill ran down my spine, an impossible paradox to ignore. "It must be tiredness," I muttered to myself, trying to ward off the growing feeling of being watched. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just that. Something that night was out of the ordinary, as if the cemetery, always so familiar, had transformed into an unknown territory. And, as much as I wanted to ignore it, the whispers continued, now closer, more insistent. I took a deep breath, determined to finish the round soon and go home. But, as I turned around, I felt a sudden heat behind me, as if someone was breathing on my neck. I turned in an impulse, and the lantern illuminated an empty path, except for the elongated shadows of the tombstones, which seemed to move slightly, as if they were alive under the fog. And it was at that moment that I realized that night was far from ordinary. I tried to ignore it. Really, after all, the mind plays tricks when the body is tired. But the whispers didn't stop. They were like a badly tuned radio, voices intertwining in broken words, difficult to understand. With each step I took, they seemed closer, as if someone was walking beside me, on the edge of darkness. The smell of smoke, once subtle, was now stronger, burning my nostrils as if something was smoldering nearby. I stopped at the main entrance to sweep the dry leaves accumulated by the afternoon wind. The ritual was always the same: clean, lock, leave. But on that night, normality seemed a distant memory. Between the sweeps of the old Piassava broom, the sound returned. Help. It was a drawn-out murmur, coming from somewhere between the tombstones. I raised my head with a start, my eyes scanning the dark field. Nothing but the elongated shadows cast by the faint light of the lantern. I took a deep breath, forcing reason to override fear. Tiredness. I thought, like someone clinging to a buoy in the middle of a stormy sea. I continued sweeping, but the whispers persisted, multiplying. Different voices, overlapping, repeating the same phrases. "Smoke! I can't breathe! Open the door!" Each word seemed loaded with despair, as if echoing memories of an ancient suffering. The cemetery, once a place of silence and solitude, now pulsed with an invisible presence. My instinct told me to leave, close the gates, pretend nothing happened, and come back the next morning, with the sun dispelling the nocturnal paranoias. But something held me there, as if those voices demanded attention, as if ignoring them was an irreversible mistake. The lantern flickered again, and this time it wasn't the battery. The air around me was denser, as if the atmosphere itself was compressing. I looked towards the area of the 13 souls. The thin fog, which previously floated over the graves, now stirred like smoke in a closed environment. The tombstones seemed more worn under the dim light, as if decades of erosion had condensed in minutes. The heat rose, dry, cutting the cool night breeze like a breath coming from the depths. And in the middle of it, a metallic, repetitive sound, as if someone was gently knocking on a locked door. I swallowed hard. My hands were sweating, slipping on the broom handle. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn around and get out of there. But, against all common sense, I advanced, drawn by curiosity mixed with fear. With each step, the whispers intensified, forming a cacophony of lamentations. They weren't just words, but muffled cries, groans of agony, as if the very soil was telling a forgotten story. When I reached the edge of the collective graves, the fog opened, revealing the tombstones lined up like sentinels. And it was there, between the cold stones, that something changed. The ground under my feet became warmer, radiating an uncomfortable heat, as if there was a hidden ember just below the earth. The voices ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence, the kind of silence that weighs more than sound. I leaned in to observe better, and that's when I saw it. One of the tombstones, simple, without adornments, just a name and dates engraved in a crude way, was slightly tilted, as if something had tried to push it from the inside out. The smell of smoke was stronger there, almost suffocating. I took a step back, feeling my heart race. That wasn't imagination. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I turned to leave, determined to leave the answers for the next day. But at the exact moment I turned my back, the lantern flickered and went out completely. In the sudden darkness, the whispers returned, now in unison, repeating a single phrase, "It's hot, very hot." The heat rose up my back like an invisible wave, and I knew that this was far from over. Very far. The lantern's blackout left me paralyzed for an instant. In the absolute darkness, the whispers seemed even closer, as if the voices were circling around me in an invisible siege. I tried to breathe deeply, but the air was heavy, impregnated with the acrid smell of smoke. Each breath scratched my throat, as if I was inhaling soot. The cemetery, my old acquaintance, now seemed a hostile territory, taken by something that defied any logical explanation. Driven by an almost automatic instinct, I went towards the small tool room near the east wall, where I used to keep candles for emergencies. With each step, the heat increased, as if I was walking towards a furnace. The shadows of the tombstones, previously static under the moonlight, seemed to move slightly, trembling like distorted reflections. The silence was broken only by the muffled sound of footsteps that weren't mine. I reached the storage with my chest heaving, sweat running down my temples. I grabbed a candle and struck a match, illuminating the space with a trembling flame. And it was at that moment that I noticed something strange. The heat was coming from outside, as if the ground was radiating energy. The candle flame flickered violently, always pointing in the direction of the 13 souls' graves. A shiver ran down my spine, and the only thing I could think was, something is trying to get out. I returned to the area of the graves, my eyes fixed on the fog that now seemed to vibrate over the tombs. With each step, the whispers became clearer, more anguished. "Water, please, it's burning." The words came in different tones, as if they were multiple voices trapped in an endless cycle of agony. When I approached, the ground under my feet was as hot as asphalt on a hot day. But it was night, and there was no reason for that. The candlelight revealed something even more disturbing. The earth around the graves was slightly disturbed, as if someone had tried to dig from the inside out. Irregular marks scratched the ground, mixed with bare footprints that moved away from the tombs and disappeared on the gravel path. My heart raced, and a primitive instinct screamed in my mind, "Run!" But my legs were locked, as if the very ground held me in place. It was then that the heat became unbearable. The air around me trembled as on a scorching summer day, and a light gray mist began to form at ground level. In the middle of it, dark silhouettes moved slowly, like ghosts walking aimlessly. I blinked, thinking it was a hallucination, but the shapes remained there, the indistinct contours dragging between the tombstones. Each one seemed trapped in their own torment, repeating gestures and meaningless phrases, like echoes of a forgotten tragedy. My body finally reacted, and I took 2 steps back, tripping over an exposed root. The candle fell, extinguishing as it touched the ground. In the dark, the heat seemed even more oppressive, pressing my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I could hear my own blood pulsing in my ears, mixed with the lamentations that now merged into a macabre chorus. The words were always the same. Smoke. I can't breathe. Water. Open the door. I tried to light another match, but my hands trembled so much that it broke between my fingers. The second strike produced a weak spark, enough to illuminate the closest face. It was a blurred figure, like a condensed shadow, but the eyes, oh, the eyes, were two empty cavities, radiating a pulsating heat. It was at that moment that I realized I was no longer alone, and those presences, whatever they were, weren't asking for help. They were reliving something that never ended. Panic made me run, my feet dragging gravel as I tried to reach the exit. But with each meter traveled, the heat increased, as if the ground itself was on invisible fire. Behind me, the whispers turned into muffled screams, and a single phrase stood out in the middle of the chaos. "You can't leave." I stopped, panting, my eyes wide with the fog that now took over the entire way back. And it was at that moment that I saw, between the tombstones, a forgotten hose, the only thing that seemed to make sense in that growing hell. Without thinking twice, I ran towards the hose, and as my fingers closed over the cold rubber, the heat around me intensified, as if something was about to explode. Silence returned, dense and absolute, interrupted only by the echo of my own ragged breath. And there, with the hose in my hands, I understood that I wasn't trying to save myself. I was trying to put out a fire that never stopped burning. I held the hose as if it were my last chance to escape that madness. My trembling fingers struggled to open the water valve, while the heat around me increased, as if I were inside an invisible oven. The voices, once distant and fragmented, now screamed in despair, as if dozens of people were trapped just below the surface. "It's burning! Get me out of here! Water, please!" Each word was a punch in the chest, taking away the little air I could breathe. Finally, the water gushed out with force, and I directed it to the graves of the 13 souls. The first jet hit the dry earth, and the steam rose instantly, as if the soil was smoldering. The smell of smoke was replaced by a metallic odor, rust mixed with something older, almost rotten. My heart hammered in my chest, but I continued, moved by an irrational instinct. It wasn't just fear. It was as if I was responding to a request that came from somewhere beyond comprehension. As the water seeped into the ground, the screams subsided, becoming muffled groans, as if the voices were receding. But among the tombstones, something moved. Blurred silhouettes, like phantoms formed from mist, slowly emerged, stumbling, staggering, reaching out translucent hands towards me. With each spray of water, they recoiled, as if the water wasn't just a relief, but also a barrier, keeping them trapped on the boundary between the world of the living and the dead. Suddenly, the hose trembled in my hands, as if something was pulling from the other side. I looked at the base, expecting to see a branch caught or some other obstacle, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The marks on the ground, those barefoot footprints I had noticed before, were now clearer, going back and forth from the graves as if someone had repeatedly walked in circles. Even stranger was that some of the footprints seemed to disappear under the earth, as if the person had been pulled down. My instincts screamed at me to drop the hose and run, but my feet were firm, rooted by fear and the strange obligation to finish what I started. I sprayed more water, moving the jet from tombstone to tombstone, as if I were extinguishing invisible fires. And, for a brief moment, the figures stopped. They stood there, motionless, watching me. It was then that I realized they didn't want to hurt me. They wanted to be freed. "I'm helping. Calm down," I shouted, barely recognizing my own voice. The water ran down the graves, soaking the earth and forming small puddles around the tombstones. And it was there, reflected in those puddles, that I saw the faces. 13 faces, different in age, gender, expression, all marked by the same horror. They stared at me for an eternal moment, as if they wanted to thank me or warn me about something I didn't yet understand. But the moment of truce was brief. The heat returned with force, and the mist thickened, as if the cemetery itself was breathing in agony. The voices returned, now in a disjointed chorus, begging, crying, pleading. Water, more water. The hose, once firm in my hands, began to lose pressure, and I knew time was running out. I ran to the valve, opening it as wide as it would go, feeling the hot metal under my fingers. When I returned, the silhouettes were closer, as if the boundary between the worlds was dissolving. Amidst the rising vapor, I saw something I will never forget. One of the figures, a woman in a light dress burned at the edges, reached out her hand towards me, and, for a second, our eyes met. Her eyes, empty and desperate, seemed to carry decades of contained suffering. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only smoke. I no longer knew if I was helping or feeding something beyond my control. The water continued to flow, and the figures began to dissipate, as if they were finally finding rest. But before the last silhouette disappeared into the night mist, a detail made me freeze. Around the graves, the footprints that had been going back and forth now all followed a single direction. Out of the cemetery, as if something had finally been released. The silence returned, heavy, almost solid. The hose slipped from my hands, and I stood there, panting, staring at the soaked and empty ground. There were no more screams, no more heat, no more shadows. Just the constant dripping of water against the earth, like a clock marking the end of a cycle. But deep down, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of something I didn't yet fully understand. When the sun finally broke the horizon, the cemetery looked like another place. The mist had dissipated, and the stifling heat of the previous night was replaced by the coolness of the morning. I was sitting on the ground, exhausted, with soaked clothes and hands still trembling. The hose lay beside me, like a sleeping animal after an intense fight. The silence, now without whispers or lamentations, was almost deafening. For a moment, I wondered if it had all been a nightmare caused by fatigue and the heat. That's how my coworker, Jonas, found me. He arrived punctually at 6, as he always did, ready to take over the day shift. But seeing me in that condition, sweaty, covered in dirt, and with a lost look in my eyes, he frowned and approached cautiously. "Antonio, what the hell happened here?" His voice sounded distant, as if I was still trapped in a limbo between the real and the unreal. I shook my head, trying to find words that made sense. "The souls, they're still burning?" I murmured, without realizing how absurd it sounded. Jonas laughed nervously, thinking I was joking, but when his eyes fell on the graves of the 13 souls, the smile disappeared instantly. The earth around the tombstones was completely soaked, as if a torrential rain had hit only that part of the cemetery. But the strangest thing was the lack of any sign of mud. The water seemed to have been absorbed by the soil, leaving only moisture and inexplicable marks. Curious and uneasy, Jonas crouched down to examine the ground more closely. That's when he saw the footprints. They were clear, barefoot, as if someone had walked through the area shortly before dawn. But the most disturbing detail was their direction. They all followed a straight line out of the graves, cutting across the gravel path and disappearing at the entrance to the cemetery. "Who was here?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't know how to answer, how to explain something I didn't understand myself. I approached the tombstones, still smelling the residual smell of smoke in the air. I touched one of the stones, and it was warm, as if the heat of the night was still trapped there, defying logic. The name engraved on the tombstone, one of the 13, seemed more worn than the day before, as if decades of erosion had condensed in a few hours. This isn't normal, Antonio," Jonas whispered, recoiling as if he realized he was facing something beyond human comprehension. Trying to maintain my composure, I went to the water valve to close it. The hose was still dripping, each drop echoing in the morning silence like a clock counting time backwards. As I turned the rusty valve, I noticed something on the ground, between the footprints. Small dark spots, like damp ashes mixed with the earth. I crouched down to touch them, and they crumbled on contact, leaving only a slight smell of burning on my fingers. Jonas, increasingly uneasy, suggested we leave it at that. "Let's pretend it was a water leak, a problem in the plumbing, anything. I just don't want to have to explain this to anyone." I agreed with a nod, not because I believed the simplistic explanation, but because part of me also wanted to bury that experience and move on. But the cemetery, I already knew, was not a place that allowed forgetting. In the following days, something changed in me. Every time I passed the 13 souls, I felt a slight tingling in my hands, as if the earth itself was pulsing under my feet. And the hose? I never put it away again. I always kept it next to the graves, connected to the valve, ready to be used. Not as a work tool, but as a symbol, a silent promise that, if those souls cried out for relief again, I would be there to answer. But the most disturbing detail only revealed itself weeks later. During a new nightly round, I found something that made my blood run cold. Around the graves, the footprints had returned, no longer heading towards the exit, but circling the tombstones, as if something or someone was watching that place. And in the center of the circle, between the tombstones worn by time, the earth was again damp, as if the water had never stopped flowing. It was at that moment that I understood. I hadn't closed a cycle that night, I had reopened it. And since then, every time the heat intensifies and the air becomes heavy, I know it's time to turn on the hose again. Because in a place like this, the boundaries between the world of the living and the dead are thinner than we like to admit. And some flames, no matter how hard we try to extinguish them, never completely go out. Since that night, Antonio has never been the same. The cemetery, which was once just a workplace, has become a territory of constant alert. The hose remained there, always ready, like a soldier guarding against an invisible enemy. And the footprints, they appeared and disappeared without warning, like marks of something that refused to be forgotten. Each drop of water poured on the tombstones seemed to calm the voices, but only for a while. The most disturbing thing is that no one else saw or felt what Antonio felt. To others, it was just another forgotten corner of the city, where life and death met in silence. But he knew that on stuffy nights, when the smell of smoke returned with the wind and the earth felt warmer under his feet, it was a sign that the invisible flames never went out completely. Now I ask you, if you were in his place, would you keep coming back night after night to calm souls that no one else sees? Or would you simply let the silence take over, pretending nothing happened? It's easy to say that ghosts don't exist until you feel their presence, until you hear the whispers that no one else hears. And if you think this was just a surge of imagination, well, look around next time you pass by a cemetery. The silence may be trying to tell you something. If the story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and turn on notifications. There's much more to come, stories that not only challenge logic, but also make you question how far the boundary between the real and the supernatural goes. And remember, Some truths prefer to stay buried, until someone like Antonio decides to listen to them.